officially starting now.
Sorry
So,
now.
welcome everybody. Today, I want to welcome my special guest. His name is William Apple. He's a teacher of psychological skills and theory, mysticism, and the esoteric, and is a mentor and a licensed coach. His work focuses on fostering each individual's own authentic and actualized beingness with the goal of guiding that individual into their own individuation and sovereign awareness. Yeah, that's powerful, man. I love that, and
Thank you.
it feels really aligned with the work that I do. And I, because you're uh, even the subject matter in your bio might go over some people's heads.
Sure.
I'm wondering if you'd be willing to break it down a little bit, so
Of
people kind
course.
of understand, what does it mean to um, individuate and find sovereign awareness. How about we dig
Sure.
into that
Start
a
that.
little
Yeah,
bit? Yeah.
absolutely. Well, first, I want to say thank you. So I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you. So thank you for that. Yeah. So individuation is a psychological term, specifically. Uh, Most of the emphasis on that topic was developed by Carl Jung, and lately, something I've been doing with sharing the topic of individuation is making a very distinct or a distinction between individualism and individuation. And I think it's a really good dichotomy to kind of see the contrast. So with individualism, for example, what you have with that process, which a lot of us, I think my suggestion is that most of us go through sort of like an individualism process when we're in our states of healing. What that looks like is like isolation, um, different coping mechanisms that look more functional, defense mechanisms that look more functional, where it's like, I'm an island unto my own. I take care of my own things. Um, I don't need anybody. I don't need a relationship. I don't, like these are like hyper individualistic sort of concepts, but these tend to be what a lot of people sort of associate with um, the healing process. And individualism is certainly sort of a platform. It's like a stepping stone towards individuation. You have to kind of go through that process to get towards individuation. But individuation itself is creating a whole human being. And that's how Carl Jung would say it. And what that means is that so much of what we do in our existence is we externalize our identity outwardly. So you know, this comes out in projections. This is also, it comes out in introjection, which is where we take other people's stories and take them on as our own stories. We internalize them. But so much of that process is through conditioning, programming, neurological dysfunction that was never really articulate or not articulated, never really given the opportunity to really become sovereign. We're kind of continue this process in our society, especially Western culture and Western civilization, where we don't really allow for rites of passage anymore. We don't really allow for these moments of opportunity for a man or a woman to go through rites of initiation, all these sort of things that help us to become more sovereign individuals. We just don't have that very much in our society. But there's a lot of evidence to support the fact that we actually not only need that from like a psychical perspective or a psychological perspective, but neurologically we actually need that. And there's we could talk about this a little bit later about the ages between 11 and 14 and why those ages are really important for the individuation process. So anyways, long story short is that what we find is that individuals are constantly going up against their own conditioning, their own programming, their own uh, traumas, etc. And what that ends up doing is creates a sense of separation from everything else. And what individuation is saying is that the total human, from the Jungian psychological perspective, is that the total human, the human as fully integrated, is symbiotic and interdependent with life in a very functional and harmonious way. So a part of what I do in my work, and especially now that I'm moving more and focusing on relationship, that I'm utilizing relationship as a platform by which we can look at and examine how an individual can individuate, meaning eradicate and or mitigate and eradicate the conditioning of programming that keeps them to be from being their authentic self, and fully individuate into a full human, in the sense of fully actualized as your own authentic self. So
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. I had Bill Plotkin on in the Tribe cast. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but
I'm not.
he does a lot of work around rites of passage, and
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
I think you'd really appreciate it. And he really talked about how most humans, modern humans, never make it out of this adolescent phase of development,
Yeah.
and it's like we're all kind of still stuck in that teenage, like trying to find our place and be accepted in so many ways, and I think a big part could be that the absence of the rite of passage, that sort of acknowledgement of you are part of this whole and you have your purpose in that whole. Like, this is what you're here for. We recognize you, we see your gifts. And I think I see so many people struggling to find meaning in their lives and finding how they fit into the greater whole of existence in
Yeah,
a
I was
meaningful
just
way.
talking about this yesterday where, and I 100% agree. I was just talking about this yesterday where, from an esoteric perspective, like this kind of gets into more specifically Gnosticism, but it certainly shows up in a few other spiritual practice or philosophies. But is the concept of like what the sort of real enemy is in our
Hmm.
daily lives, and it really is. And again, it's like specifically in Gnosticism to talk about this. And this is coming up more in like more neo-psychological modalities, say like acceptance and commitment therapy or relational frame theory, polyvagal theory. These concepts are starting to come up, which is that the enemy is the notion that you're separate.
Hmm.
And if we and like what you're talking about, these rites of passages and like how you framed it, which is like, we're including you, we see your talents, we see your skills, we see you as the person that you are. We want to honor that process. We want to honor and invite you into a different relationship with the collective, either the tribe or the total human experience, however you want to frame that. But there's a process of acceptance on the social structures that's really is very essential, I think, to the neurological development of the human being, whether it be men or women. And this actually gives an opportunity for me to talk about that age gap of 11 and 14, which is what we, when we look at, there was, and I saw this research a year ago or so I can't remember the author, and I don't have it on me, but there's this research that was put out about with regards to this time period between 11, at the ages of 11 and 14. And what we find is that during that time period, there's a massive amount of brain cells, brand new brain cells that are moved into the frontal cortex. And what all those brain cells are there for is to learn new skill sets. And of course, if you think about it, for hundreds of thousands of years, our tribal systems were developed, our indigenous systems were developed to have these rites of passage, have for these individuals who were moving out of this stage of adolescence into adulthood to be recognized. And these are your skill sets. You're going to move training and to become this for the tribe, or you're going to do this for the tribe, whatever it is. um, you would go into more of an adulthood state, and we have neurologically been designed by that process to require that. But like you're saying, and like what was it, Bill Plockton, is that what you said his name was?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, what he's, I 100% agree with that. What that's suggesting is that um, we don't have those systems, and because we don't have those systems, like you're saying, like he's saying, we stay in adolescence. And that's what I find we find with both men and women, is that we, and I myself included, up until 2015 or so, stuck in adolescence, scared child and boy, basically trying to be an adult and not having the skill sets to know how, because nobody taught me how to do those things. Nobody was around to be a functional male figure. And that's a pretty prolific sort of systemic issue that we do have in our Western society. And I think a lot of it is because we don't have these rites of passage. We don't have these things that our neurology is deeply ingrained to desire and have and claim. So yeah, absolutely, 100% agree
Mhm.
with. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in the meantime, right, like we've got this absence of, a human need that we evolved with for probably many thousands of years to have
Yes.
like a sense of tribe and belonging.
Yes.
In the meantime, we have this modern construct of culture and what
Right.
we are. And I know you do a lot of work in relationships, and
Yeah.
yeah, so I'm curious, like, do you see that whether it's intimate relationships or relationships that we intentionally develop, are, is there a way that you see that they can kind of start to fill those developmental needs?
Yeah, absolutely. And this has actually been a really powerful shift for me personally. Because when I first started coaching and started putting my content out there, which is about 2 years ago now, I was the individuation guy, which I think initially a lot of people, and certainly the way that to some degree, the way that I proposed that or initiated those conversations was um, sort of more emphasizing the individualism. It wasn't intentional, but looking back, realizing, oh, I could see where that was going, um, as opposed to the totality of individuation. Anyways, but now there's this process that, and something that I've recently claimed, and this is going to get to answer your question, but something I've recently claimed is that for um, since I was 15, and I didn't have the wording for it at that time, but I had a whole series of events, like had my own internal rites of passages that happened around 14, 15, 16, that, and it wasn't really recent until the last couple of years that I realized that what I've been working on, devoted to, etc., was this concept of hieros gamos, which is kind of a hot button topic in the intimacy coaching community. I look at it from a much more psychotheological perspective, or like a Jungian perspective, and then the esoteric alchemical perspective of those concepts.
Mhm.
But which I think is a far more functional process. But what it shows us is that this process, and what that process of study and my own integration and my own work that I've done around that concept of hieros gamos, is that everything is relationship. I can have a relationship with this desk. I can have a relationship with the air between, if I'm very focused on my breath, and I can have a relationship with the air between me and the screen. Like I can have a relationship. We can have relationships with anything, and
Mhm.
so everything really is relationship. In fact, actually, from even like an esoteric or a psychological, or even like a consciousness research perspective, where we're starting to acknowledge this fact that we're all kind of mass hallucinating to some degree, where
Right.
we're projecting, yeah, that what we perceive is literally what manifests existence, right? So, but because that's a very intimate symbiotic relationship, well, everything is relationship. So for me, the last year has been really focusing on how do we utilize relationship as a healing modality. How do we, because so much in our society, we have this almost aversion. We either have an aversion to relationship, or we have a very dysfunctional association with relationship, whether that be intimate relationships or parental relationships or a relationship with authority figures. There's a lot of divisiveness that's happening in our society, in our cultural conversation and discourses and experiences around this conversation of relationship. And we have these we also have, on top of that, we have these conditionings and programmings about what it's like to go through the healing process. And we have these ideal archetypes of, like, say, Jesus or Buddha, or the gurus who go up in the mountains and they isolate and they go through these process of transformation. The reality of it is if you actually study those esoteric teachings, or you study the gurus themselves, they'll say, yeah, what I did is extremely rare. Not everybody's going to be able to go do that. And in fact, actually, so much of what they suggest that we do as people is that the healing process actually be through relationship. Attend to your duties, go get a job, marry, have children, but be earnest in your self-healing, be dedicated to that process. And both, like if you get married in a relationship, both of you be dedicated to that process, both of you show up. And how do we heal? How do we actually hold ourselves accountable? How do we actually, all those things. And so that's, we have this conditioning and programming that says, well, relationship is dysfunctional, so we just dip and we go up in the mountains and we try to like heal, or we do yoga every single day or whatever it is, or we meditate every single day. And the reality of it is that yes, relationship is probably, in my opinion, the most potent and healing medicine there is to the individuation process, because in relationship we get the opportunity to really have someone, especially an intimate one, get the opportunity to have deep things mirrored back to us that we wouldn't see in anyone else, because somebody who knows us that intimately, well, they're going to see all the deep stuff inside of ourselves. So those relationships create the opportunity for us to, and I've been talking about this a lot too, is it helps us to create the opportunity for the Athanor, or the alchemical furnace, for us to really be able to burn off the dysfunction if we're really committed to that process of healing. And so, yeah, if you set the container right in a relationship, if you set the intentionality appropriately in the relationship for both of you, then absolutely relationship can be one of the most healing modalities out there, in my opinion. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. I agree, and one of the most challenging containers in a way, because
absolutely,
it will reflect, in my experience, all of the unconscious stuff that we just haven't gotten the mirror for. And
yeah.
I'm
actually of the mindset at this point in my process, my own internal process, and my career and my research, all the stuff, all the above, and my own process of those things, that I almost like, if you really want to do the work, and get to know yourself, get committed to that, get a foundation, like get a coach, get a therapist, somebody that's going to help you to establish, very functional coping mechanisms, like have values, boundaries, all those kinds of things, and then get into a relationship. Not like, not just like any relationship, but just focus on, finding the kind of relationship that you're going to really grow and heal through. And you can find that and do it, because like you just said, in that relationship, that mirror is going to show you everything. And if you really want to see your stuff, be in relationship with someone. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, what would you say? Because it sounds like there's a twofold process, and in the sense that there's a recognition that we're in relationship with all of existence, and you mentioned the term hieros gamos, or I don't know how you say it exactly, but
hieros gamos,
you didn't exactly define that, so I'm curious if you could break that down, what that means. And this is just another layer to this question, is like, at what point, and it's probably not a linear thing, but if there is some point where there's like more readiness of our capacity to step into the container of relationship, from your perspective, knowing yourself and your values, and knowing your boundaries, like you said,
right,
those kinds of things, like, and also I guess what would, how could somebody enter a relationship a little bit more intentionally, right, versus the way that most people find relationships, is just like seeking to kind of fill some, this is my perspective, kind of seeking to fill some hole in themselves that feels incomplete.
Yes, 100%. I agree with you. Yeah. So I guess to touch on hieros gamos for a second. Hieros gamos is a Greek word. It means divine marriage. The interpretation of that, or a sort of foundational interpretation of hieros gamos, is this idea of the divine marriage between the gods. But I look at it from, again, more alchemical, psychotheological perspective, which is that it's not like the gods are essentially just archetypal structures, cyclical structures in our own systems. Again, I take a Jungian approach to this, and Jung actually, in his own ways, wrote kind of extensively about it, but more focused on the individuation process. But excuse me, what he was ultimately pointing to was hieros gamos, and so what it means is the divine marriage between the opposites within ourselves. So all of existence is dualistic. All of our language is dualistic. If you have, one word, well, there's going to be a dichotomous or opposing word that sort of, says, well, this is this and this is this, right? So, and because language itself is inherently dualistic, well, then all of our concepts are inherently dualistic. But then if we're identifying with those concepts, then we ourselves are identifying with duality, as opposed to what the spiritual teachings, the esoteric teachings, the et cetera, is that we're not actually, or even the science, behind that now, when we look at quantum biology or consciousness research, is that we're not actually separate from anything. We're all entangled. There's a whole process of, we're deeply, deeply connected to everything. And we know that, even empirically speaking. But it is the distortion of our dualistic thinking that makes it, that we struggle, it creates our suffering. And again, that enemy being this concept of separateness, that we are separate from something. And so what Hieros Gamos is doing is saying, we need to unify that duality into a singularity, where that singularity is both encasing the duality, but also the non-duality as oneness, as a totality of something. So that's a bit esoteric, but that's essentially what Hieros Gamos is. It's the idea of actualizing your full self, your full human identity, to where duality and non-duality exist simultaneously within your own cyclical constructs. And the ego can't handle that. The ego doesn't know what to do with that. It, like you share that, and the ego goes, well, we don't do that, because the ego is very dualistic. But so anyway, so that's what Hieros Gamos is in a nutshell. And when with regards to the readiness of being in relationship, my suggestion is we definitely have a very dysfunctional relationship with that sort of structure of that readiness. We can be very perfectionistic, because we tend to be operating from fear with regards to stepping into a relationship of any kind, whether it's friendship or an intimate partnership. And so we feel like, well, in order for me to show up and have this kind of ideal relationship, well, I need to be whole and healed within myself, or I need to be perfect in some way, shape, or form, so that I'm ready. And I want to speak to that, because I think that's quite dysfunctional to think that. We're not, the healing process for most of us is going to be lifelong. It's going to be a rare person that goes, I've gone through the healing process and I'm a complete whole human being. It's just rare. I mean, just statistically speaking, it's just a rare thing. So, I mean, I'm still going through it. At most everybody that I know, I don't care if you're a psychologist or, a guru of some sort, like, you're still going through the process. You're still in it. So the reality is like, if we wait until we're ready, we're never going to be in anything. We're never going to have a relationship with anything except for our own dysfunction. We're never going to have those mirrors back. We're never going to, like, it's just not in the way that we're designed to do, or that or that most of us are actually desiring to do. So my encouragement, especially like with the coaching work that I'm doing now, and there's another project that's unfolding with regards to relationships that we're going to be announcing soon. But there's a process of, yes, we want to establish your values, we want to establish your boundaries, we want to get very clear with, like, the dysfunction of, like, why it's been hard for people to have boundaries, why, like, how do we get our values, how do we set standards for ourselves, all of those things. Like, these are really important foundational structures for us to just be ready to step onto the platform of relationship of any kind, again, friendship, parents, intimate partners, whatever. But that we get very clear with ourselves, like, okay, I hold myself accountable, I know that this is my responsibility, so I'm going to take responsibility for that. That's the first step. And then start looking at questioning why we do what we do, and then getting disciplined with that by setting new standards, setting values, setting boundaries, all those things. And if you do that, and that doesn't take a long time from my experience, usually, a month or two of, like, working with either me or anybody that does that kind of work, establishing those systems within your own cyclical structures, gives you the preparedness to step onto that platform in a relationship and start having those conversations, because where your boundaries are. And they're going to move, they're going to be flexible, you're going to evolve, etc. But having that established is a great starting point. And I also am of the mindset that there's a couple that I'm working with now where they're already in relationship, but they're ready to step up and, like, heal and have those conversations. So you can definitely be in a relationship and do the work and start establishing those things. You don't have to. So there's really no time period where you're really ready. It's just a matter of, okay, well, what am I doing and what do I desire? What do I want? And be very clear about that. And then just kind of go get it, for lack of a better way of saying it, which is, either get professional help or start researching, do reading, I don't know, whatever it is, but I definitely, if I could give like some skill sets for people to work on their own, on their own accord, if they don't want to reach out to a coach, establish your values, start learning about boundaries and how to establish them for themselves. Yeah. And getting really clear with why it is that, it's been hard for us to establish those things in the first place, defense mechanism, coping mechanisms, all that stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Love the way you broke that down so clearly. Yeah. So you brought up while you were sharing about the Hieros Gamos, this idea of, we have this kind of inner opposite gender or part of our psyche. And, uh, this is something because I work primarily with men, and there is what I see in modern male culture is there's a need in some ways to develop our healthy masculine because certain aspects of our modern culture are now, there's a lot of shame around being a man and what it means to be a man.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so as much as we do work on that, there's the anima, as I think Jung put it, is like it's our inner feminine, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit to that, and your experience in how to come into healthy relationship with our own inner feminine, and even tools to do that, what that looks like, what that feels like?
Yeah. I think that's, especially for the men in the group that are listening to this, like, absolutely. It's so important that we look at this topic specifically. And I am going to be doing a round table on this topic. Hopefully that's going to happen in June with some really wonderful people. Yeah,
Cool.
I think it's a really important topic. And here's why. First, there's some distinctions that I'm going to make with regards to this topic. So I operate from a more esoteric perspective, or a more psychotheological perspective on and I would say an evolved awareness of the concepts of masculine and feminine from a psychotheological perspective, being specifically a Jungian perspective. So when Jung first sort of established animus, masculine and feminine, as these archetypal structures within our psyche that impact us unconsciously, he naturally associated masculinity with maleness and femininity with femaleness. But if we look at the esoterics or the alchemical process or the mystery traditions on these topics, what we actually discover is that the masculine is a entity all on its own that is not maleness. It's non-gendered. Feminine is also non-gendered. What they are is and I'm just setting this as a foundation because I know where you were going with it, but I want to be clear on this as a distinction. The masculine is this nothingness. It's empty space. It's unconditioned. If we look at it from like as an example, I always point to this, like from a Gnostic tradition, like a Gnostic spiritual tradition, Gnostic Christian perspective, which I would consider more of the functional spirituality with Christianity. There's a reason why Isho, or Jesus, was always pointing to God the Father and God the Mother. I mean, the God the Mother part got taken out of the scriptures due to politics and etc. and power grabs. But those concepts from a Gnostic tradition were always there, and then they got taken out. God the Father is the masculine. And if you look at what Jesus was teaching the entire time, he was teaching unconditional love. He was teaching this process of like, how do we show up unconditionally without any distortion, without any dysfunction in our systems? How do we do that? So again, masculine and feminine, masculine being nothing, this unconditioned state, and the feminine being everything else, and specifically duality. And so those structures are important to distinct, because really what we're talking about is concepts around maleness and femaleness. What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a male? And so much of our society has created a narrative about what those are supposed to be. And those narratives about around what they're supposed to be are both conscious and unconscious. The unconscious aspects of that, which by unconscious means that we literally have not brought it to any sort of conceptual understanding. It's there, it's established in our nervous systems, it's established in our psychical structures, but we just don't have any functional awareness of it because we don't have any concepts of it. But what ends up happening is that those narratives about what it means to be a male and what it means to be a female get established into our psyche, right? And the unconscious parts of that about what it means to be a female get internalized into the male psyche, and there's a whole bubble world of unconscious reality of what it means to be a woman. And that is the anima that the men hold. And it's like, and this kind of gets into positive negative polarity within the energy systems within the body, but we won't get into that right at the moment. But the point is that anima is those unconscious narratives, abstract narratives that men hold on within their own structures, their own cyclical structures, that they then project outwardly, unconsciously, onto women about what they're supposed to be. And of course, this goes the other way with women. Women do this with their animus, their own male narratives about what men are supposed to be. And all of that, the anima and the animus, is projection. It's unconscious projection that we're outwardly pouring onto our partners in a hetero relationship. But this happens also too in any sort of other sort of sexual relationship. It's going to happen differently in the structures, but pretty much everybody's doing this all the time. So that's what that is. The anima is this unconscious narrative about what women are supposed to be to men specifically, and that tends to be in hetero relationships, though it does show up in other sexual relationships, sexual orientations. So that's what that is. I think you asked me another question, but I've lost track of that.
Yeah, I forgot what I asked you to do, but
I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, just based on that, right? So you've kind of reframed my understanding of it, which I really appreciate, because sure. It's like you're saying it's the unconscious understanding of what the opposite gender is in some sense.
Yes.
And I guess to me from there is like, what is the process around creating a conscious relationship?
Yeah, and I think that was I think that's where you were. Yeah, that was the other part of that. So the way that I operate, and I certainly consider my work to be like an evolution of Jung's work. The way that I operate is sort of structured. The intention is structured. It can kind of go all over the place a little bit sometimes, but the intention is structured. So I look at this work again from a psychotheological perspective and an archetypal, like an archetypal psychologist. What that means is that I look at this as I love story. I love a big part of how I interpret the world is through story. I love what Steve Jobs said about like the most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. It's true because we're all storytellers. We all tell ourselves stories. And if we really can understand that we realize that we tell the stories, well then, and we start owning that, when we start reclaiming how we interpret stories. So as a part of that process, one of the things that I've done with the work that I bring to the table is I've looked at these major archetypal stories and created a system by which you can utilize that archetypal structure within those stories, these myths, which myth really is like, how do you frame this? These mythological stories that we have, which I'm going to give an example for in a second. These mythological stories are like direct sort of imprints of where the collective unconscious was at a certain given time in existence. So that's what the myths are doing. These myths are expressing the collective unconscious at specific times in history. And some of those collective unconscious myths, those myths, are deeply impactful for hundreds of years or even sometimes thousands of years, depending on the structure of the myth. So they're deeply important to look at. And what I've done is I've taken specifically the hero's journey, which, of course, really expounded upon by Joseph Campbell, but also looked at from a Jungian perspective. And I've taken the hero's journey, and really where I started at, now I'm looking at the story of Tristan and Iseult. as a concept of romantic love, but that's another thing. Where I started at was with the journey of Percival and the search for the Holy Grail, because that's a very alchemical. I mean, if you look at this process of individuation, the process of individuation and the story of the Holy Grail from an alchemical perspective is literally that journey. It's like a blueprinted journey, but it's made out in the story of myth. And this kind of myth is, it's pretty universal, whether you look at, Isis and Osiris, or, all these different sort of major archetypal myths. This hero's journey is pretty universal. But I'm a huge King Arthur fan, and so Percival and the Holy Grail is where I went. What you find in that story is that, Percival sets off. He's the warrior. He goes out, and then he goes to the swamplands. He fights monsters. He does the task, and then he claims the Grail. That's how it works in a nutshell. How I've broken that down into the structure of how I encourage people to look at where to start in this work and how you can build a healthy, functional relationship and reclaiming your anima and your animus, etc., is that warriorship is the inner child work. And inner child work is like, it's not really a solid, psychological concept. I mean, there's people that think that the inner child is a thing. Certainly, if you look at internal family systems, the inner child's definitely a thing. But it's a little bit of like a gray area. If anybody thinks that the inner child's a thing, I absolutely do think it, because that's the work I do, and I see it every single day in the work that I do.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Yeah.
Yeah. But the inner child is where I always start, because so much of the conscious projections that we have in our world and our relationships comes from the inner child, because those are conscious narratives, whether it's like subconscious, and I don't mean unconscious, but subconscious, meaning just below consciousness. If so much of our reactions to people's choices, our judgments, our projections, all that stuff is coming from these nervous system responses that we learned in childhood. Absolutely. And so what I encourage people to do is we go through this inner child process. You go and you begin to build a very healthy relationship with your inner child. You learn how to reparent yourself. And that process of doing that is an act of warriorship, is an act of reclamation. So you're training to become a warrior, to go into the swamplands, which I consider the swamplands to be the shadow of the soul. So in order to access the shadow work, right, and this is getting to the anima and animus in a second, but in order to do the shadow work, you first have to do the inner child. And I'm 100% like, this is that evolutionary part of the Jungian work, which is, he was kind of like, well, let's be psychoanalytic about it, and we're gonna, what's this thing? And it wasn't as direct. Like the transcendent function wasn't as direct as I'm pointing to it now, which I'm not saying my way is the best way, but it's certainly a way that I find to be very functional and very helpful when people utilize it. But we focus on the inner child work, because what you're doing in that moment is you're reclaiming these very obvious wounds. Like if you really just take a minute to look at it and differentiate and compartmentalize, like how you're feeling. I reacted to this. I felt a trigger here. Those are everybody experiences those things every single day. So if you take that opportunity to really dissect those, when you're getting into the inner child and you're reclaiming yourself, and as a process of that, you're warrioring up. Then after that, once you've really, really reclaimed your inner child, then you can start really you can step into real deep shadow work. And another concept that's like doing the inner child works helps you to get onto more of a middle path, like a middle way from like a Buddhist perspective of moving between duality, finding this center ground of how we move between extremes. Because so much of what we end up doing in our dualistic perspectives in relationship is we are reacting in extremes. Well, this thing happens, so I'm gonna go way the heck over here and respond. Yeah. Or like this thing happened, I'm gonna go way over here and respond, because you're trying to avoid the pain of the event, right? So you go to these extremes, you run away from it essentially. What we want to do is get back to the centric place of this middle way. So the inner child work helps us to do that. It helps us to get to this middle path of seeing more clearly and more objectively, being less reactionary to the extremes. And that's like discernment and the sort of boundaries, the armor that we need to put up so that we can go into the swamplands and start facing our demons that we have in our internal psychical structures. Once you get into the shadow work, then as you get closer to the deeper shadow work, that deeper shadow work is going to give you direct access to the anima and the animus. So when it comes to, how can people show up in a relationship and do this work and be committed to it and create healthy functional relationships, create sacred containers, all those things. Again, we don't want to wait until we have access to the anima and animus to show up in a relationship. What's really important that we just hold ourselves accountable and be dedicated to this work. So that when we do show up in a relationship, we know that if our partners go, hey, I did A, B, and C, or I want to do this thing, or whatever it is, that whatever feelings we have come up inside of us because of that response, or that where they're at, that we've done the work, so that we're established and earnest in the work, that when we show up in those conversations, that we don't project outwardly. We have our feelings, we hold ourselves accountable, we take responsibility for those feelings on our own accord. We process them with our partners if we desire to do such. And we have an exchange where I'm holding myself responsible, you're holding yourself responsible. And a lot of that is just that initial work of, kind of the first stages of inner child work, where it helps you to establish that process. So yeah,
it makes sense. Yeah, so it's almost like I've never heard inner child work being framed as a kind of warriorship, but it makes sense because, really what I see in inner child work is you kind of have to go into the feelings that you've avoided most of your life, and that's uncomfortable.
Super uncomfortable. Nothing fun about it. Well, I will say, because I often get told, like, the work, when I talk about the work, people go, well, it doesn't sound very sexy, it doesn't sound very fun. And I'm like, it's not at first. It's hard, it's grueling, but eventually it does come fun, I think. It becomes more natural.
Yeah, I know. It's always the tricky part when it goes to like marketing.
It is. I know. Like, believe me.
The stuff that really sells, needs to be sexy.
I know. It's hard.
Still figuring that out, but
yeah.
Yeah. So I see it as a little bit of a homecoming. This sort of returning to what we don't want to be with, and there's a certain resilience that comes with that, and maybe a kind of integration, just getting in relationship with the inner child and the pain that's there. And I think that is a really, not that it can't happen once we're already in relationship, but it does pave the way for more capacity to be able to hold, say, even our partner when maybe they haven't done that work. And
absolutely.
Yeah, I guess, and I got curious earlier because I think this is an important question. Like, this is what came up for me hearing you speak was, say you've committed to being accountable to being on this path, and maybe your partner hasn't.
Sure.
And do you have any advice for, say, a man that's in that place? Maybe he's been with somebody for a number of years, or it's a new relationship, and he's very deep into, and I know this can go both sides, but I'm trying to speak to the man.
Focusing on men. Absolutely.
So how might a man inspire his partner to do the work, or is that something that just people need to come to on their own, in your experience?
My immediate response, and this is kind of it's not a reactionary response in any way, shape, or form, but it's a bit of a protective response, like a little bit more of a rigid response, in the sense of being boundaried. So I say this as a lesson in boundaries.
Yeah.
As a foundational lesson in boundaries, is that if you're committed, if you're the man in the relationship, and you're in a hetero, well, it doesn't really matter. If you're a man in the relationship and you are doing the work and your partner isn't, and you want the relationship to continue, what we really want to do is, and this is why I talk about standards, what we really want to do is establish those standards. Well, what kind of relationship do I want to have? And this is a distinction between expectations. The standards are your own accountability of what you want and desire. You get very clear with that. And that's a evolutionary process. It's always going to be evolving. But you get very clear with what you desire, what you want in a relationship. And you show up. You say, these are my standards. This is what I desire in relationship, we can't expect anybody else to agree to that. I mean, we can, but if we expect it, well, then we're giving that power away, because then we're relying on the other person to show up and say, I'm either going to do it or not. And then the only way that you feel safe is that they do it or not. So that gives that power away, right? So the standard is that you go, this is what I'm desiring. How does that feel to you? And the other person goes, yes or no. If they go no, it's not then the protective part of me goes, that relationship's not for you. It's time to walk away.
Yeah.
That's not all. The more evolved parts of the relationship, you're going to get more into alignment, energetic feeling of being very clear. It won't be an intellectual process. It won't be a strategy. It won't be like, well, this matches this and this matches this, and it won't be that. It'll be an energetics, but that's a little bit more advanced. Mm-hmm. So at starting out, just getting very clear with your standards and presenting that to your partner and saying, this is what I desire in a relationship. Do you align with that? No, you don't align with that? Great. Well, then we're going to part ways. Yes, you do align with that? That's great. And when they say yes, that doesn't mean they're going to show up the way that you think they will. Right. But they've made a commitment to that, and they say, yes, I align with how you frame that, and maybe they ask whatever it is. But you have a conversation, and they say, if they say yes, well, then cool. You're on the same page at that point, and you have an agreement. Okay, we're doing the same thing, and that's going to show up in different ways. We want to be very mindful not to, again, project those expectations of what you think they should show up like. I mean, again, that's that anima coming out a little bit, but at least with regards to a hetero relationship. But yeah, setting those standards, getting very clear with what it is that you want, presenting that to your partner, and then saying, okay, do you like it or not? And if they say yes, great, you can continue on. If not, then you move on. And that's the more that, I talk about this too, like when I'm dating, or if I go on, if I have an initial interaction with someone, which I'm not doing right now, but if I had initial interaction with a partner or potential partner, I have a list of things. I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm doing this. This is what I want. This is where I'm going. I'm very clear with what I want. I know what I want. And I'm not going to waste your time. You're not going to waste my time. Like, and I say that like playfully, like it's not like nobody can really waste my time, and nobody can, but I'm not going to show up and be like, and not be clear with that on that first date. I want these things. Does that align with you? No, great, cool. If it doesn't, then thank you for your time. This is great. We can be friends, or you can have a conversation, whatever it is. But I'm going to move on, because I know what I want. I'm very clear with that. And that's where, like, setting these standards, doing the inner child work, because doing all those things is going to help you get very clear with what you want. So really, it is about, if you're really wanting a functional relationship, it's getting very clear about what your desires are, what your drives are, what your motivations are in relationship are. And some of that's going to be dysfunctional. That's also okay. That's whatever. Just own it. No shame, no blame, no guilt, any of those things. Just own what you want, show up, present it, and then proceed accordingly after that, and with other people's yeses and nos.
Yeah, and I imagine just the value in going through that process and having standards, knowing where you stand, and it's going to help you to kind of attract and manifest somebody that can actually meet you there on some level.
Absolutely. And, with that specific topic, like, I'm of the mindset that, of course, like manifestation and actualization of experience, of calling things in that you desire in your life, it's not, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but a lot of people think of like, like The Secret, or like manifest, where it's like, I'm just going to think about it a whole bunch, I'll pray about it a lot, and it'll show up. That's not at all how that works. It takes action. It takes you taking a moment of action and saying, I'm going to make these choices so that I can actualize. It's a symbiotic relationship. You don't get just like, it just doesn't work that way. And even from a quantum biological perspective, I mean, what we're seeing in that research, it shows that we have to be intentional and action oriented with what we're designing in order for it to manifest, to draw it in. So yes, absolutely. If you're creating those standards, if you're getting very clear with what it is that you want, and you're acting on that, you're showing up in relationship and saying, I want this, I don't want that, etc. Well, then absolutely, it's going to make space for what you do want, because you're clearing out what does align with that and what doesn't align with that. Absolutely.
Yeah, that really fits with my work. I do a lot of work around integrity, which is about our values and taking actions that are aligned with those, and all these little micro adjustments in our alignments, which are our choices, eventually compound and start to structure our experience of life in alignment with that. So it is an active process. for sure. Um, yeah, so we've just got a couple of minutes here for our live broadcast, and then we're going to close it down for the tribe group here that are
Okay.
on the Zoom call with us. Um, yeah, I think the only last piece that I wanted to touch on with you that I think would be valuable for the audience is um, working with our intuition. And
Mm.
there's sometimes feelings and associated feelings that we get that are related to our traumas and our wounds that are kind of in our body mind experience. And then and then there's you know intuition that in my experience really starts to it comes from that place of deeper alignment that I was speaking of. um, there's a quality and a clarity to it
Mhm.
that feels like a truth. And
Yes.
but it's hard to speak to because it's very experiential to the individual. um, and but I was wondering if you would speak to that a little bit,
Yeah.
distinguishing if there's any way to tell the difference, between like just something that's calling to us or speaking to us that's sourced in our wounds and maybe even like an avoidance strategy, and something that's like, you know, this is what needs to happen here. This is what feels right here.
I'd absolutely be happy to talk about this, though I'll give a disclaimer is that how I'm about to frame this, a lot of people may not like hearing, but that's fine.
Yeah, good. We like to
90, yeah, 90,
do that here.
99, yeah, 99.9% of people don't have any relationship whatsoever with their intuition. And the reason that I feel confident in saying that is because what we do have a very intimate relationship with, though it's oftentimes unconscious, is our trauma. So intuition, I'm really happy you brought this up because it is sort of like a lot of people talk about like the same thing with like empath, like being an empath. Most, not everybody's an empath. Like it's just not a reality. What we are is very sensitive due to traumas and experiences. That's what
Hmm.
that is. It's not empathy. And I really have a very I think it's a really important distinction to make, a differentiation to make in our cyclical structure. So those sort of things, these sorts of conversations are very important because, again, narrative and the stories that we tell ourselves, well, they become our realities, but our realities can be very distorted if they're based on traumas because this trauma is distortion within itself. So, so with regards to intuition, um, most people don't have a relationship with intuition. I like how you framed it, though. It lets me know that I feel like you have a relationship with, for my own, my own perspective on that and my own interpretation of that you do have a relationship with intuition because it is an alignment process. It is a very clear knowing of a personal truth, which again, like you're saying, personal truth is very subjective. But from an objective standpoint, the the patterns, because I look at patterns more than anything else, the patterns that sort of show up that go, at least from an egoic perspective, the patterns that show up are pointing to that. I mean, most of us, again, when I say 99.9% of the people, 99.9% of the people on the planet are operating from trauma responses. That's just the reality. Like the sooner we own that, the quicker we can get to the work, which is not about being quick or efficient, but it's just reality. The sooner we can own that, the great. Yeah. So that trauma is like you're talking about, where that trauma is going to dictate how you respond to things if you don't hold that accountable, if you don't look at that. Absolutely. If you're not taking the time to look at those trauma responses, of reactionary responses, and even like, for example, on a practical level, let's say, for example, you have an event in front of you, there's an experience that you have, and that experience lights up your body in some way, shape, or form. Like either you have a little bit of like a repulsion, or you have an attraction. If your body's lighting up, that's a trauma response. it's a trauma response.
Yeah.
Because your nervous system is going, ooh, that feels safe based on my trauma, or ooh, that doesn't feel good based on my trauma.
Mm-hmm.
That's not intuition.
Mm.
Those are very distinct things. Intuition is a very clear, very grounded, very just like, oh, that's what we're doing, and you just go do it.
Mm-hmm.
There's no questions asked, there's no nervous system response, it's none of that that's happening. Intuition is very clear, steady, and it's just an inner knowing that it's time to go do the thing, and you don't have a reaction to it in any way, shape, or form. So most people don't experience that. Most people, I think, interpret intuition as like, oh, I had a body reaction to this thing. That's my intuition telling me that I need to not be involved in this experience, or I do need to be involved in this experience. And that's actually not intuition. That's trauma responses. So
Yeah, that's really well put. I love that, and that really resonates for me in my own experience.
yeah.
And you've articulated it in such a way that I probably couldn't have, but it's really true. There's a sense of that groundedness. It's just like when I feel like I'm really hearing, and I know I get both, right? I get the whole spectrum.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, there's like a stillness that the intuition comes from. It's like a knowingness that
Yeah.
is very non-reactionary. Yeah.
Very. Yeah. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, man. Well, I'm gonna close down our live broadcast. So thank you for anybody that tuned in on
Yeah. Thank you,
Facebook.
everyone.
And actually, before we close that down, is there anything that you want to share with the live Facebook community about your work, how to get in touch with you if they're inspired by this conversation?
Sure. So, my website is ionpsychodynamiccoaching.com. If you go to my Facebook page, it's right there. You can find the link. You get a little, I'm actually going to be going through a little bit of an overhaul on the website, but it gives you an overview of what it is that I do. You can also sign up for sessions there. I am in the process of still filling 5 slots. I have a goal of 5 more clients. I'm looking for some, and I'm very discerning on who I choose, because it's a very specific process that I go through. But I would love to have 5 more clients. So if you're interested in my work, I'd love to be working with you, especially after listening to this conversation. I think it was actually a pretty good, succinct overview of the totality of the work that I do. So I love the questions. So yeah, if this conversation resonates, please, reach out and let's have a conversation, see if what I offer works for you. If you need to, you can PM me. If you're, since we're watching on Facebook, you can PM me on Facebook and reach me that way, or you can go through the website. Either way. And yeah, that's it. I would love to work with you if you aligned with what was said here. So.
Yeah. And you're also, I don't know if this is an open thing, but you mentioned these roundtable discussions that you're doing. Is that kind of a closed thing for the time being, or is that something people should get in touch with you about?
So I've shifted a little bit. What it initially was, the intention is like, hey, let's just have a big powwow, and just have conversation, that sort of thing. They do a Zoom call, that sort of thing. But now it's becoming a bit of a production of something I'm very excited about. It's a big project, or not, it's a relatively big project, which I'm very excited about. So what I would say is that with that roundtable, and those roundtables are going to be talking about relationships and the sort of these cyclical structures that we've been talking about in this conversation, but other ones as well. Like, I think the first one's definitely going to be on anima and animus, because I think it's a really good foundational place to start, even though it's like the unconscious. It kind of sets the goal and the intentionality of where we want to be going in relationship is towards those 2 points, because that's where so much of our unconscious projection on other comes from. But then we're going to get into the idea of like tension in relationship and polarity and sacred relationship and all this stuff. Like, I think I would like to do a conversation on Hieros Gamos. So if any of that stuff is interesting to you, be on the lookout, because I think the first thing that we're going to do is probably going to be in June. That's what I'm shooting for, is like the middle of June. What that'll look like is some version of this, which is it will be a paid event, but we're going to keep the prices down to minimal, where everybody can kind of, as many people as want to, can join it, and as much as I can handle logistically on Zoom calls. But it'll be on those topics specifically, kind of like what we've done here, where it'll be a round table of individuals where we'll have a back and forth and have a discourse and a dialogue where you're going to get multiple points of view on these topics, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A at the end. And I'm really looking forward to the project itself. So yeah, if that resonates with you, just be on the lookout. I'll probably be announcing something in the next couple of weeks, and then the event itself will be in the middle of June. So
yeah, that sounds great. So yeah, make sure if you're tuning in from the tribe or the Essential Man page, to follow William Apple on Facebook. He's got a ton of great content that he puts out on there. It's really super insightful. I think you're on Instagram as well, right?
Yes.
And that's under your business name.
Yeah, on psychodynamic coaching. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Cool. All right. So, hey, gentlemen, we got a couple guys from the tribe that decided to join.
Very cool.
And Skylar.
Skylar and Jason.
Jason, not sure if you're still with us, Jason, but yeah. So, how's it going, gentlemen? I'm curious, like, what landed for you from this conversation? What spoke to you? And if there's anything specific that you might have questions about with William that you wanted to bring.
Oh, I can.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
You jumped in first.
Oh, okay. No, I just think it's pretty amazing. That all this stuff fascinates me. I just actually, I'm at the very end of a master's degree in counseling, and I just wrote a paper actually on it's actually on male psychology, male attitudes towards help seeking, and a lot of it, the latter part of it, was focused on actually Jungian archetypes. So the king,
beautiful.
warrior, magician, lover.
Have you read that book?
But I have. I got
so good.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then there's actually an updated one called, it's by, I think his name's Boothroyd. I've only read a little bit of it. It's
I've seen that, but I haven't read it yet.
Instead of it's lover, king, magician, word or something. He just switches one of the words. But some of the a lot of the things, a lot of those things are that just feels like the tip of the iceberg for me. And it's interesting because in my program, and I think psychology in general, they acknowledge Jung, but because Freud was so,
he's the foundation for Western psychology.
Foundation. Yeah. A lot of unfortunately, Jung doesn't always get the credit I think he deserves, and so
it's changing, but no, he does not.
Yeah. But I guess to focus on, like, one thing you were mentioning, because all the things you're talking about, like with the animus and like inner feminine and masculine, that idea of the masculine being like an absence is that's the first time I've heard it explained that way, but that actually makes a lot of sense, because I was thinking in terms of like decision making, which is more personal for me. I think of decision making as, I think we actually had another speaker come on, Soma, I'm forgetting his name, the one right, I'm blanking on his name, but he was talking about how the masculine is more of like the go forward and like do, whereas feminine can be more kind of trepidation dwelling, more of that consideration phase. So it's like, instead of taking decision, being more heady and thinking about, I think of it also like in artistic ways too, like considering all the different outcomes. But I was thinking, one of the things you were mentioning too, which also kind of applies in terms of, you're mentioning like relationships, both, friendships or dating, and being like very clear, having like a clarity of what you're maybe bringing, like even in those first moments. And I'm wondering, I was kind of curious about how that, well, one is like how that's either addressed in your coaching, but also I guess if you care to share personally, how that's integrated in a way where it feels, you feel, or you would coach, you would like tell others to feel in the most comfortable way, bringing like, I guess what I'm trying to say is like what's being very clear about what your expectations are, or what your values are, especially with another person. So that way, to basically like, that way there's not this feeling of like wasting time, or feeling like, I don't know if you know the term emotional labor, but like laboring to present yourself in a way because you care about like an honest connection, but then feeling like, well, what's this game that's like where there's like a game that's being played, which is like,
right.
who, you know, are we just kind of doing small talk?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, a lot of that, and it's true. A lot of the, you know, the dating dating is, you know, that tends to be the thing.
And friendships too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, you know, yeah, there's always like a lot of like tiptoeing. It's like you know, and it's a vulnerability thing. I love Brene Brown's work, because she talks about, you know, vulnerability and how important it really is. And it really is. The more vulnerable we can be with ourselves, the clearer that we can get with ourselves. And of course, the clearer that we can get with ourselves, the clearer we show up in our relationship. So, you know, it's one of those things where until we get vulnerable with ourselves, what ends up happening is it's like we kind of like, you kind of like cast a little thing out there and see how people respond to it, you know, and go, oh, that feels safe. Okay, cool. And it's totally understandable. It makes sense. Like, you know, because if we don't have that intimate relationship with our own vulnerability, well, we don't feel comfortable to really kind of just like, here I am. And because then, you know, it feels sensitive. So yeah, I have found through that process of, I mean, and this is again why I focus on the inner child work, is because if you do so much of the inner child work is getting very vulnerable with yourself. I mean, it's just an inevitability. If you're doing the inner child work, you have to get real honest with yourself. So yeah, so with regards to setting up those, the how we approach relationships, you know, and it shows up to the more that we do this work. It's interesting. The more that people do this work, it's almost like the less social we become, but in the sense of like quantity. But when we do show up in social structures, it's very present. It's very, because you're there because it's very clear that you want to be there. It's an alignment. It's this whole thing. And so it's almost like you get very selective. They say like, you know, the more to the top you get of something, again, hierarchically looking at this, but the more top, the lonelier it is. I like to frame it as like, the more that we do the work, the more selective we get, because we're getting very clear. We're getting very clear with what it is that we want, what's an alignment for us. And we don't accept anything less than that at that point, because we know, you know, what we're looking for, and et cetera. So yeah, when we show up in those relationships and we're kind of establishing, you know, or deciding if we want to move forward, being very clear with, our standards, our values, you know, and presenting those pretty much just upfront, I think is the most honest and loving thing that we can do to other people, because it's like with other people and for ourselves. One, we're not self-abandoning ourselves because we're really clear, we know what we want. And then we show up to the other person. We're like, this is who I am. Do you like me? No? Cool. I'm out. Like, I'm gonna go find somebody that does like me. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking like the idea of like less is more, but like it's the less is actually like, I guess another way to put it is like meaning is more, like being focused rather than like worrying about. Because I think Soma was saying it earlier too. Both like it's also just based on culture. I get the sense a lot of times that, especially in this Western culture we're in, there's so much almost, there's such a fear-based like initial even engagement where it's like, oh, I guess we have to be, we like that superficiality is almost expected, because we've been scared into that.
Yeah.
And yet that doesn't it's rare, but it's special when you then find it with people where you don't go there, because then you really feel that connection.
Yeah.
But like you said, I think a lot of it ties to intuition as well, which I hadn't thought about, which is it depends on whether a person's really intuitive, and like there's almost like, it's hard to even describe sometimes. It's like this like connection of there's no superficiality that has to happen because it's so direct,
clear. Yeah, I mean, and that's, you know, I also too, from, you know, an esoteric perspective, which I like to frame more as psychotheological, but from that perspective, you know, as within, so without. Are you familiar with that term? So if you're clear in here, then you're going to show up clear in your relationships, and then it'll be very clear if that's a relationship you want to pursue or not. And yeah, once you find those people that are in alignment, it's like a whole nother world of relationship. And there's no judgment, or there's no, you know, anything on the other kinds of relationship, but yeah, it really does. The relationships just show up way differently the more clear you are with yourself. Absolutely. And you know, and that's the process, you know, but yeah, absolutely, I agree. So just to be clear, I've got I've got to hop off in like 10-ish minutes. So, Skylar, did you have a question? Do you want to?
Yeah.
And also, Jason, did I?
No, that was great.
Okay.
I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the way you said that. And yeah, I'm
Okay.
gonna, yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Okay, great.
Yeah, we'll make sure to wrap you up with plenty of time.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, just what do you need, like a few minutes before the hour?
Just like 2 or 3 minutes. Yeah, because
okay.
I've got a client right after this. So
sure, no problem. Yeah, Skylar, you got something?
Yeah, hey guys, really enjoyed this conversation. Feels like it's been sparking a lot of downloads. To begin with, the Heroes Commos really sparks a lot going on in my head with just the interconnectedness with the physicality of our world and the elementals. I've been going through a bunch of injuries lately, and I'm kind of realizing that it's like my relationship with the physical world, with gravity, with the earth, gravity being our Heroes Commos to the earth.
Yeah.
And yoga being the guide to our relationship to the physical world and whatnot that I've kind of been neglecting. And as I'm sitting here, I got a broken rib, broken foot, knee going out, dislocated shoulder.
Do you have a laborious job? Is that what you do for a living?
Yeah. I do a bunch of gardening, horticultural stuff. And tree work and whatnot. So.
Nice. I used to own a landscaping business, so I relate to that. I love being outdoors and working. Anyways, yeah, but it is very laborious.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I just kind of saw that connection. Thought it was really cool the way you're talking about it. So.
Yeah, I love that. I love how you're, especially when you're looking at it as a relationship. It really, and one of the things that, I agree, doing something like yoga, something physical to really get you back in your body. Because here's the other thing too about yoga that, a lot of people don't know, but maybe you guys do. So one of the exciting sort of modality and therapeutic modalities is this idea of bilateral stimulation. And so bilateral stimulation is, this component of how we, our brain, and it accesses neuroplasticity. Our brains they're not hardwired, but they definitely have rigid structures to them, but they're also plastic or malleable. And how we are able to actualize that, one way that we're able to actualize that is through bilateral stimulation. And bilateral stimulation can come up in different ways, like EFT tapping is a version of that, or one of the things I teach my clients is a butterfly hug, where it's you take your dominant hand, you make it less dominant, you cross over your hand, you can do some tapping, or you hug yourself, you like, what it does, it puts the neurology into a confusing state. Like, for example, like as an extreme version of this, if the thing in high school where you do the hands, you overlay them like this, you bring them back in and you try to move your fingers, so that whole thing, that's bilateral stimulation. And what makes it confusing, of course, is that our brain, our left and right hemispheres are looking at those neurologically, but then when you look at it, it's confusing to the brain, so it doesn't really know what to do, and it offsets the standard sort of operating procedure that the brain wants to go through. What's really beautiful at that point in time, when you're in that place where it's this liminal space of the brain doesn't really know what to do, it's kind of confused, is that you actually have a plasticized brain. You have or more plasticized, not entirely plasticized, but you have more of a flexible neurology at that point, so you can really train it. You can train it to do things. Yoga is bilateral stimulation. So when you're doing the opposites, you're doing everything's like you got to make sure that you're doing the the crossovers and all that stuff, and everything has to be balanced out. It's bilateral stimulation. So I highly recommend yoga as a practice for individuals that are navigating various different things. And also, like you said, it helps you to build a relationship with yourself, but a relationship with the ground, with the earth, with gravity, etc. I'm a martial artist, so I do martial arts as a way to kind of root myself and ground and get back in my body. But absolutely, having that relationship and acknowledging that relationship with everything, it is like, if you're falling and you're getting injuries, it's actually, this is a good example. I'll share this too. Like, so with regards to martial arts, I used to be a semi-pro when I was younger, and recently got back. I've got had kids, did the whole thing. Now I'm getting back into training. One of my favorite systems is Muay Thai. I studied Muay Thai for years. I went to an MMA gym about 2 months ago, and was in it, just like, woo, like I'm having a great time. I mean, I was almost vomiting, but I was still having a great time, and because I haven't done it training like that in a while. But I was hitting the pads, and I was throwing an uppercut, and I sprained my wrist. And that literally, as you're saying, is a direct correlation with like how I was showing up in the relationship with the Muay Thai. My relationship was coming from this excited place. I was like pushing myself to limits that wasn't in a functional sense of how I'd want to be actually showing up in the relationship with Muay Thai. Instead, I was coming from an excited place. I was like, oh, I'm back in it. I'm like, and I definitely had some old narrative that was coming up about how I used to train. I'm 40 now. When I was training then, I was in my late teens, my early 20s. So my body could do a whole bunch of different things that I can't now. And I just showed up in the same way mentally, and I didn't have a functional relationship with it, and I got injured. So it is really about how we show up in our relationships in that way. And so I like how you frame that, because once you acknowledge that you have a relationship with everything, well, then you can show up more intentionally in that process and potentially create less injuries. So
So the other nice thing that I liked you saying is how we can use our relationships to heal traumas as well.
yeah,
There's always, this understanding in society, I think, that like you can't fix your partner or whatever if they're broken. And I agree with that. You can't fix anyone, but you can work together to heal traumas, which is a nice, refreshing thing.
absolutely. And I appreciate that reflection, because I think that's touching on something that has been a trauma for a lot of people. That trauma being specifically what you just spoke on, which is we kind of are getting, those shoulds, this what to do in a relationship is like, well, because I know there's like a popular meme that goes around. It's like, if you don't heal your cuts or whatever, then you're going to bleed all over everybody. It's like this, it's like you got to do the work before you show up. And yeah, to some degree, yeah, what really is important, in my opinion, is just that accountability part. Just going, look, I've got shit like anybody else, but I want a relationship. I'm going to hold myself accountable. I'm not going to project that out. Or if I do, I'm going to hold myself accountable. And it's like, as soon as I recognize it, I'm going to go, yes, I was projecting. I'm going to bring that back in. But that accountability part is so huge, because then you get to show up and you go, look, yeah, these are my feelings. If I project outwardly, well, I'm going to hold myself accountable. I'm always going back to this accountability place. You do that, then, you have the potential to set up a really evolutionary relationship where you are creating a healing container in that relationship. If you both are holding yourself accountable, sky's the limit, in my opinion. So,
because there's no avoiding relationships, it's like you said, we can't all be aesthetic yogis living in caves.
Yeah,
and if
and
you
honestly,
don't have
I don't know
a
if I'd want to
relationship with a woman, if you don't have a relationship with a woman, you're going to have a relationship with your roommate or whoever else is close to you.
Absolutely.
And be playing out that same stuff, all those childhood traumas and stuff with that person. So you might as well dive deep with someone you can really go deep with.
Agreed. 100%.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for sharing, Skylar. And I'm curious for you around creating more intention in your relationship to your body and to your environment. If there's anything you want to name in this container of how you might want to approach things differently, because I don't want to see you keep getting injured repetitively. So I'm curious. I just wanted to invite that before we close out here, if you want to name anything.
Yeah, I definitely need to focus more on my relationship to the physical world. Like I have this really strong drive that's just kind of pushing me to ignore what's going on in my physical body and just keep on going. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of skipping over the work that I have to do to maintain this machine that's my vehicle for doing that work.
And I just want to sort of call forward even your languaging there, and like calling your body a machine, right? So I mean, obviously maybe it could be somewhat, but that could be also how you're treating it. And so that you could start right there with Like, what would be maybe a kinder, more compassionate word or name for your vehicle?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I would second that from Soma. Like, you know, if the body is a machine, which I can certainly see the analogy there. If it is a machine, it is probably one of the most sensitive machines ever developed. So it's something that is a, you know, it's like how I, you know, especially with like this inner child works, that sort of those concepts. Like, we look at our bodies and we look at them as machines. Because I've been there. Like I've said, I've had laborious jobs. I've done like I've you know, I've worked in construction. I've been a roofer. Like I get like, and I've pushed my body to limits that, you know, not a lot of people do. And I did that to a large degree. Like I still push my body to limits, but it's a different relationship now where I'm like very present with it. Before, it was like I thought it was just a machine and I could just make it do whatever I wanted it to.
Right.
But in the process of that, you know, I had a lot of injuries. I you know, and definitely feeling it now, moving, getting older. So yeah, I think having like that intimate, and also too, the other way I look, the inner child work is like, I look at the body, of course, like the body of the somatic system as the inner child, the nervous system as the inner child. And if the inner child, like, would you go and treat a child like a machine? I mean, some of us do. Some of us treat our children. I mean, I know, like when I was younger and I wasn't informed as much as I am now. I certainly treated my older son like a machine to some degree, and it's just conditioning, it's programming. But the same thing with our own bodies. Like, yeah, looking at it as just a machine can create a lot of dysfunction. But if you look at it as like, this is actually a child, like this is something that's very delicate and it wants to grow up and it wants to heal and it wants to, you know, it has a whole life on its own, like as a living organism. Well, then you'll show up and have a much more loving, kind relationship with with your body. So
Yeah, you probably need to jump off, man. So I want to end there.
I do, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that, Skylar. And thank you so much, William, for showing up here. I really dig your perspective. It's really sharp and insightful and unique and powerful. So thank you. I'd love to have you as a guest at some point in the future, and stay in relationship, stay in communication with you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Invite me anytime. I love this conversation. I think it was beautiful. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Have a great day, everybody.
All right, my friends. Goodbye.
Thanks.